All right. So today on the BP Mindcast, we're going to talk about code debt and why code debt is not the same thing as real debt. So, first of all, I'm going to say that you know I actually like the term code debt. I think code debt, for those of you who don't know, is that when you're writing a program and you come across something that you're like, you know what, I'll fix this later. Or, if you have a release date and you're like, okay, well, we have to release next week. What are we not going to implement and we'll just implement later? And this might be something that's a feature, or it may be something like structurally you need to alter. In fact, that's probably the bigger use of the term code debt is when there's something that needs to change structurally in your code, but you're just work around it for right now and you'll actually fix it later. So code debt, it's really good for communicating issues to managers. For basically like you're saving time now, but you're borrowing from the future. And sometimes managers have a hard time with you working on features that you've already implemented, but saying that telling them that you're paying off code debt gives them a metaphor that they can better relate to. So I don't think the term is bad. In fact, I think it could be helpful in a lot of situations. But there is a difference between code debt and real debt, and we need to think about those more often and take the differences more seriously. Because sometimes people treat code debt as if it were literal debt. So the so the biggest difference between code debt and real debt is that real debts all have to be paid. Um, so like if I borrow $1,000, it doesn't matter if my project succeeds or fails. I still owe you $1,000. But code debt is different. So code debt, if I so let's say I have a project and I don't know if it's going to be successful. If I go into a lot of code debt and the project is unsuccessful for reasons unrelated to the software, so for example, let's say I have a new product idea and I'm like, I have no idea if anyone's going to use this. And I put it out there, it works fine, but it's got a lot of code debt. So it might be something where you know what, I really need to restructure this, or I need to re-implement this, or maybe I'm not logging enough, or something like that. And it winds up there's just no customers for it. Well, the nice thing about code debt is that if for some reason a project is canceled, or you decide not to go with a software product of some sort, in those cases, the code debt is also canceled. So one way in which code debt is not like real debt is that you don't have to pay it back. If for some reason you stop working on the code base, then code debt just goes away. And so this helps you better know when you actually should go into code debt. And basically on highly speculative projects, there's no reason not to go into code debt. I've seen a lot of people on highly speculative projects be like, well, we need to rewrite this. We need to rewrite this. No, on a speculative project, you need to get something out there that functions so that you know if it's worth investing further in. So you can get, so, imagine if you're going to heavy code debt to get something done. Well, if it's a success, that's not a problem. You can then use the success to justify paying off the code debt for the next release. But if it fails, you've saved a lot by going into code debt. So unlike real debt, you can actually get a lot of savings by going into code debt. Um, the other thing is that code debt has early payment penalties. So one of the things when people talk about code debt, one thing they're often talking about is refactoring. Okay, so they want to refactor their code so that it works better. But the problem is that you don't always know the best way to refactor something until you've really used it a lot. And so sometimes if you refactor early, you're just wasting that time, because what happens is that a month, 3 months, 6 months down the road, you'll have accumulated more features and you'll realize that your refactoring was focused on the wrong thing. And so you'll have to refactor it again. And so sometimes if you refactor too early, if you pay off the code debt too early, you wind up having to repay it again. And so it's kind of, I view that as kind of an early payment penalty. And so sometimes, unlike other debts where the sooner you pay them off, the less interest you'll have to pay on them. On code debt, uh, the sooner you pay them off means that you're not paying them off with the benefit of seeing where the code is going in the future. So the other thing is that the I actually think that code debt sometimes gets smaller as it accumulates for the same reasons. Um, so code debt, if you have if you have a project where the code debt uh, as you accumulate features, you're going to find that more and more of them kind of align in the same way. And so rather than refactoring 5 different systems, you'll say, oh, well, I can see how one system can take care of all of this. And that's something that's harder to see early on. It's harder to make that inference early on. It takes some time to sit with you. And so kind of if you wait, then you can sometimes refactor it in an easier way. So you might initially be like, oh, I really need to redo this. I really need to redo this. But you might have a good conception on how it should be redone. But if you wait, if you take some time and you let it sit on your brain and you accumulate more examples, you might find out that, 3 months down the road, rather than taking, 2 months to refactor and it only being kind of a half done job, it might only take you 2 weeks to refactor, and it makes all of your future code go faster. So now the problem with waiting on refactoring is that sometimes it does cost you more. So for example, let's say that you find out that due to the way that you structured your code initially, as we add more features, it takes 5 days to add each major feature. But if I restructured my code, it would only take 1 day to add each feature. But restructuring the code itself will take 10 days. All right, so the more features we add, the more restructuring, the more we're wasting time that we could have saved if we restructured our code. And also, you're going to have to wind up restructuring those features when you restructure the code. So it's going to be a bigger debt to pay. So those are just the things to factor in. And so my main point is not that you shouldn't pay off code debt or that you shouldn't use the concept of code debt, but just that you should recognize that there is a difference in the dynamics of code debt and real debt. And taking the concept of code debt too literally and too seriously, I've seen cause lots of unnecessary work done, especially in speculative projects. If there's one thing to take away from this, is that if you're doing a speculative project, going into heavy code debt is actually okay. That's fine. It could wind up paying off for you in the long run. So anyway, so that's BP Mindcast for today, and